The roar of the surf breaks against the black rocks of Lindisfarne. Flocks of seagulls shriek over the monastery, and shadows appear on the horizon. Not a fleet, a pack of predators. Their boats, narrow and flexible, like snakes, glide over the waves. In a few minutes, the first Vikings will come ashore, and an era will begin, which chroniclers would later call the Age of Terror. The year 793, the day when Europe first heard the cry of the North Wind, carrying death. What could compel people, accustomed to prayers and silence, to flee from holy walls as if from the plague? Why did kings, accustomed to commanding thousands of warriors, begin to fear a few dozens of Scandinavians in boats? And what power drove these people through storms, ice, and fire, to where their name was not even known? The answer lies not in fury, but in cold calculation and in the iron discipline of the Northern Sea. Modern archaeologists have found traces of their lives in the most unexpected places, from the coast of Greenland to the shores of the Caspian Sea. But the origins of this expansion lie in Scandinavia, at the end of the 8th century, a harsh world where the land is stony, winter lasts most of the year, and a harvest could be lost from a single frost. This was a land where only those who are ready to fight for every patch of soil and for every piece of bread survive. Here was born a system that historians call Druzhina. This is a military brotherhood, where each warrior gave an oath of loyalty to the Jarl, the local chieftain. The word Jarl meant not just a leader, but a person whose power was held not by blood, but by personal glory and plunder. A Jarl could not command by right of birth. He had to prove his right to power with a sword. This created a unique structure, a society where strength and honor stood above the law, but every man knew the value of his word. The image of their world was simple. The eternal darkness of winter, fire in turf houses, and the smell of salted fish, mixed with the iron of weapons. For children, instead of lullabies, stories of seas where dragons guard gold, and of gods drinking mead from the skulls of enemies. These myths were not fiction. They shaped character. That is why when a young man first took a sword in his hands, he was already ready to die for glory. But it was not hunger and not myth that made them raise their sails. The key lay in climate change. After a short warming period, harvests grew, and the population along with them. Land became insufficient. Clans began to seek a way out, and found it on the sea. Their ships, called drakar, were a technological marvel of their time. A longship is a long vessel with a sail and oars, light yet strong, capable of moving both on the sea and on rivers. Archaeological finds in Oseberg and Gokstad confirm that such ships could cover up to 100 kilometers a day, an incredible speed for that time. Imagine the sound. 30 oars strike the water in unison. The wooden hull groans under the assault of waves, and on the bow, a carved dragon's head. This is not merely an ornament, this is a warning. A symbol of power and terror, which was meant to inspire fear long before the landing. When the monks of Lindisfarne saw these heads, they perhaps recalled lines from their prayers, "God deliver us from the fury of the Northmen." Thus was born the first prayer against the Vikings, and the beginning of a fear that would envelop the entire continent. But why specifically Lindisfarne? Why did the attack come not to a rich city, but to a monastery? And what in this raid was so terrible that chroniclers would call it a sign of the end times? The answer is hidden in their code, an unwritten law of sea warriors, where death was not an enemy, but an honor. It was precisely this code that transformed them from ordinary pirates into a symbol of fear for all of Europe. In the north, there were no kings, only chieftains. Each of them held power by force, cunning, and the trust of their Druzhina. And each understood, if there are no new lands, there is no plunder either. And without plunder, there is no glory. Glory for a Northman was the same as air for breathing. Without it, a person ceased to exist. In their songs it was said, "Better to die with a sword in hand than to rot nameless beneath the earth." This was not poetry, but a philosophy of survival. Among the warriors, a special place was occupied by those who were called berserkers. These were not merely fighters, but people entering a state of fury in which they felt pain as little as a rock feels rain. The word berserk meant in a bear's skin, a symbol of wildness and invulnerability. They were described as demons of battle, bare to the waist, foaming at the mouth, eyes bloodshot. Modern historians debate whether their fury was caused by a narcotic mixture or a religious trance, but archaeological finds, skulls with characteristic close-range battle injuries, confirm that they fought as if they truly knew no fear. Behind every campaign stood not chance, but calculation. Before departure, jarls arranged a thing, a popular assembly, where it was decided who would go on the raid. Here they chose the route, distributed the share of plunder, determined how many warriors would remain to defend the settlement. The thing was the heart of Scandinavian democracy. Even a simple warrior could rise and challenge the chieftain if he believed he was acting dishonestly. It was a world where authority was more valuable than blood, and if a jarl lost respect, his place was taken by another, one capable of leading to wealth or death. Before a campaign, blacksmiths worked day and night. Iron in Scandinavia was rare. It was extracted from bog ore. To obtain one sword, metal had to be smelted from several hundred kilograms of earth. Such swords were called ulfbert, after the mark engraved on the blade. Modern metallurgists have proven their steel was so pure that its quality surpassed even the weapons of the Mediterranean. This was a symbol. A sword, born from bogs and fire, became an extension of its owner's hand. A Viking's armament weighed about 15 kilograms. Chainmail, a round wooden shield with an iron boss, a spear almost 2 meters long, and a short sword or axe. But the Vikings' strength was not only in their weapons, but in their formation. Their tactic was called the shield wall. Imagine a line of dozens of warriors, where each shield was interlocked with the next. This was a living curtain, an iron palisade behind which fury and discipline were hidden. When such a wall advanced, it broke the enemy's ranks not with blades, but with mass. It was a cold, methodical killing machine, where everything was decided by seconds and training. Historians note it was discipline that distinguished Vikings from ordinary brigands. Chronicles state that they were able to land, attack, and retreat faster than a militia could be gathered. Their ships could enter a river only a meter deep and suddenly appear dozens of kilometers from the sea. This made them unpredictable, like the storm itself. English monks wrote, "They come like a fog and disappear like a shadow." But not everyone who boarded a longship returned home. The North Sea is not a path, but a trial. The water is icy. The wind can overturn a vessel in seconds. And yet they went. Why? Because every campaign was not just a hunt for gold, but a step towards Valhalla, the heavenly hall where fallen warriors feast with the gods. To die in battle meant to conquer fate for them. This cult of death and glory turned them into people who could not be intimidated. When archaeologists excavated burial mounds on Björkö Island, they found the remains of warriors buried with swords, horses, and silver. Some were burned along with their ship, a ritual symbolizing the transition to another world. Even in death, a Viking did not leave the sea. Soon their sails will appear on horizons where no one expected them. While Europe prays for peace, the North is already sharpening its swords. And when the first cry of ravens pierces the sky over the coast of Britain, kings will understand. A storm is approaching that cannot be repelled. Early in the morning of June 8th, 793, the sea off the coast of northern England was calm. Waves quietly rolled over the stones. The monks of Lindisfarne began their prayers. And suddenly, a sound, not a cry, not thunder, but a low, rhythmic beating. Distant at first, like the heart of the earth, then louder, closer. It was oars, striking. 30, 40 strokes in unison. Ships emerged from the fog and red shields rose above them. On the bow of each, a carved monster's face. From that moment, England awoke to a new world. The chronicler Alcuin wrote, "Never before has such terror been seen on the shores of Britain as that brought by the men from the north. They entered the monastery as if it were a fortress and did what no one expected, destroyed the sanctuary, killed the monks, burned the altars, took sacred vessels and books bound in gold. This was not merely theft. This was a challenge, a blow to the very heart of the Christian world." At that time, monasteries were not only spiritual centers, but also repositories of wealth. Silver, grain, precious fabrics were stored here, and most importantly, there was no guard. For the Northmen, this was an ideal trophy. Their scouts, those called scouti, tracked down suitable targets in advance. A scout is a maritime reconnaissance agent, experienced in navigation and stealthy observation. Without such people, a raid would have been impossible. They determined wind direction, approach depth, tide schedules. Everything that appears in chronicles as a burst of fury was, in fact, cold strategy. Modern researchers note, the attack on Lindisfarne was not spontaneous. The ships sailed with precise calculation according to the wind, and the landing itself occurred during the morning ebb tide, when the shore was exposed and the monastery was isolated from the mainland. That is, the Vikings did not just burst in. They chose a moment when the enemy could not even call for help. Thus began an era that historians call the first wave of Scandinavian raids. When the Northmen departed, they left behind ash, blood, and silence. For the inhabitants of Britain, this was something beyond human comprehension. They believed that the end of the world had come, that this was punishment for sins. But for the Northmen, it was only the first step. Their sagas said, where the enemy does not expect, there begins the path to glory. A few years later, new longships appeared off the coasts of Ireland, then in Frisia and France. According to various sources, by the mid-9th century, hundreds of crews were operating along the North Sea coasts. Their main strength was mobility. They did not build empires. They destroyed others. Their success was due to the fragmented state of Europe at the time. Kings fought among themselves, lacking a unified fleet. The Vikings became the catalyst that showed how vulnerable Christian states were to an enemy coming from the sea. But the sea was not their only weapon. They also knew how to attack by land, using the tactic of a blitz raid, a lightning-fast assault followed by a retreat. The modern term raid originated precisely from these actions. Their strike was like lightning, instantaneous, destructive, and before the storm could fully arrive, they were already gone. Archaeological finds on the coast of Northumbria confirm the Vikings did not merely plunder, but systematically removed everything valuable, from gold to slaves. The slave trade became one of the foundations of their economy. People captured in raids were sold in the markets of Ireland and Scandinavia. One slave could be worth as much as a pair of swords, and it was precisely this gold and human chattel that allowed the Vikings to build new ships, buy weapons, and form entire armies. In 9th century chronicles, the first mentions of long camps appear, fortified bases where Vikings wintered to return to sea in the spring. One such camp was found near the Thames, remnants of earthworks, weapons, bones of horses, and people. These fortifications were a harbinger of a new stage, the transformation of raiders into invaders. But for now, Europe saw them only as a shadow. Elusive, merciless, like a storm. They came when the bells of morning service rang and disappeared, leaving behind ash and legends. Kings tried to buy peace with silver, but each ransom only sharpened the Northmen's appetite. The more gold flowed north, the more longships put to sea. Thus, fear became a constant companion of Europe. But what compelled these people to risk their lives for plunder that could sink in any storm? What made them so cold-blooded and merciless, as if they were fighting not for life, but but against death itself? The answer lies in their faith, ancient, dark, and unlike any other religion in the world. To understand why the Vikings knew no fear, one must look at their gods. They did not pray for mercy, they invoked glory. In their myths, there was no eternal peace, only eternal battle. Valhalla, the hall where fallen warriors feast with Odin, was not a paradise, but an arena for endless battle. Each morning the fallen revive, take up their swords again, and fight until evening, only to die anew. For a Northman, death is not an end, but proof of strength. That is why he went into battle with a smile, knowing that to lose meant to gain eternal life among the gods. Among such beliefs, the concept of weird was born, fate that cannot be changed. This is not a sentence, but acceptance. If your hour has come, you cannot hide, but until it arrives, you are invulnerable. This is what made them terrifying. Warriors for whom the fear of death was a meaningless sound. Modern researchers note that such a worldview code became their true weapon, far more dangerous than swords. It was with this faith that they embarked on their farthest expeditions. The 9th century became a time when raids turned into conquests. Their flotillas were no longer limited to dozens of ships. According to chroniclers, some raids included up to 300 longships. The sail alone of such a vessel was the size of a house, and its mast as tall as a pine tree. Archaeological reconstructions show that the crew of a large ship consisted of 60 warriors. This means that up to 20,000 people could participate in a single raid, an incredible number by early medieval standards. They landed in the Frankish state, burned monasteries along the Seine, stormed Nantes, besieged Paris. The chronicler Abbo wrote that the city breathed smoke like a blacksmith's bellows. King Charles the Bald tried to raise an army, but Viking ships passed by fortifications, ascended rivers like a knife through a wound, and struck at the very heart. Paris held out only because its walls were new, and the priests paid with silver. In exchange for ransom, the Northmen lifted the siege and departed, leaving corpses on the banks of the Seine. Their campaigns were not merely marauding, it was a strategy of pressure. Modern historians call this the military economy of fear. They struck where the enemy was weak and withdrew without engaging in prolonged battles. Each new raid undermined trade, destroyed internal connections, forcing the enemy to expend efforts on defense. Europe paid silver for peace, and with this silver new ships were built. But fear turned into legend. When the Vikings landed in Ireland, local clans called them alien gods. In their camps, amulets with raven images, symbols of Odin, were found. Around the warriors' necks hung Thor's hammers, symbols of thunder and war. Archaeologists find these artifacts across Europe, from Dublin to Kiev. They are like markers of a path left by a storm. A special role in their successes was played by the connection between religion and military culture. Every battle was perceived as a sacrifice to the gods. Before battle, they would throw a spear into the air, dedicating it to Odin, a sign that blood would be shed by the will of higher powers. This ritual was called sperhid, spear gift. First an image, then a word, a short throw before the first strike. To a modern person, this seems like superstition, but for a Northman, a ritual opening the door to glory. The Vikings did not merely fight, they built a myth about themselves. They themselves turned their deeds into songs, which were later recorded by skalds, warrior poets. In their verses, blood sang on the snow, the sword gnawed at the hearts of enemies, and the sea was called the path of the dead. This is not an exaggeration, but a way of memory. For the more terrifying the legend, the fewer enemies would dare to stand in their way. During this time, Europe began to change. The fear of the Northmen gave rise to new armies, new fortresses, and even new prayers. In churches, the words resonated, A furore Normanorum libera nos Domine. From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, Lord. These lines were repeated across continents like a mantra. Even centuries later, when children's fairy tales spoke of monsters, they were often called simply Northmen. But with glory always comes greed. The farther their flotillas went, the greater the risk became. They began not only to attack, but also to settle. The first permanent settlements arose on the shores of England. Here they mixed with the local population, brought their customs and laws. Thus began the transformation of brigands into colonizers, a process that would change the map of Europe forever. And yet their glory did not fade. Every new Jarl wanted to repeat the feats of his ancestors, and each dreamed of dying in such a way that a song would be composed about him. But history knows the price of pride. When a wave rises too high, it must crash. And this wave would crash when the kings of Europe themselves stopped being afraid, and for the first time repelled the Vikings. By the end of the 9th century, Europe had changed. Kings who had recently paid silver for peace began to build flotillas and fortify their coasts. The experience of war with the Vikings became a school of new military thought. But the Northmen were not going to stop. Their ambitions grew with their influence. Now they were not just raiders, but entire peoples living by the sea and the sword. They founded the first cities: Dublin, York, Hedeby. These settlements became trading centers where everything was sold, from Arabian silver to Byzantine silk. Archaeologists find weighing scales, Arabic coins, and weapons with Frankish kingdom markings there. All this proves the Vikings became not just warriors, but a link between East and West. But with wealth came a new challenge. The longer they lived on foreign lands, the more they lost the wild strength that fueled their victories. The descendants of the first raiders were born not to the howl of blizzards, but to the ringing of church bells. Entire regions emerged in England. The Danelaw, the land of the Danes, where their own laws prevailed. One such law was called wapentake, an assembly of armed free men who judged legal cases. The word itself means touching of weapons, as voting was done not by raising hands, but by striking swords against shields. This was a symbol of new power, not chaos, but order built on strength. Meanwhile, forces capable of opposing the Northmen were emerging on the continent. Frankish kings created standing armies trained to repel naval invasions. They began building towers along rivers, outposts, and stone walls around monasteries. Chronicles state that this period became a turning point. For the first time, Europeans ceased to be victims and became students of the Vikings. Their enemies adopted their tactics, their shipbuilding technologies, their reconnaissance. The year 878 was decisive. In the south of Britain, in the marshes of Athelney, the remnants of the Saxon forces gathered, led by King Alfred. Against them stood the armies of Danish Jarls, led by Guthrum, a formidable commander who had burned half of England. Alfred used tactics he himself had adopted from the Northmen: surprise and mobility. He created small strike teams that attacked enemy camps at night and disappeared before dawn. In the spring of the same year, the Battle of Edington took place, marking a turning point. The Anglo-Saxons defeated the Vikings in open battle for the first time. Contemporaries wrote that after the defeat, Guthrum was baptized, took the name Athelstan, and kissed the cross, a symbol of submission. This was not merely a religious act, but a political capitulation. Alfred the Great became the first ruler who not only stopped the Northmen, but also understood how to tame them. He gave them land, recognized their rights, but compelled them to swear allegiance to the Christian faith. Thus, fear turned into an alliance, and raids into the foundation of a future kingdom. But not everyone accepted this peace. Some Vikings went southeast, to the rivers of Eastern Europe. There they became known as Varangians. Chronicles state the Varangians were summoned from beyond the sea to rule over us and administer justice. Thus began a new chapter in their history. the path from the Varangians to the Greeks, a path leading to the creation of Rus. Archaeological finds in Ladoga and Gniezdovo, swords, Scandinavian fibulae, ornaments, confirm the Northmen left their mark here too, far from their fjords. But in the west, their power gradually waned. Europe learned quickly. In the 10th century, the Franks created ships capable of catching longships. Fortresses grew taller, garrisons larger, and even the sea, once their ally, now often turned against them. Storms destroyed entire flotillas, and trade, once a source of strength, turned into a trap. The last great raids, on Paris, Seville, and Lisbon, no longer brought the same glory. Instead of warriors, merchants, craftsmen, and mercenaries increasingly came. The fear of the fury of the Northmen was replaced by respect for their skill. Europe, having endured centuries of terror, absorbed their energy and transformed it. From blood and gold, fire and wind, a new civilization was born, hardened, disciplined, capable of defending itself. And yet one question remained open. Why could people living in a harsh land, without bread, without sun, make an entire continent tremble? Perhaps it was not their strength, but the fact that they knew no limits to their capabilities. For where others saw the end of the world, they saw the beginning of a path. And it was this faith, in themselves, in fate, in glory, that made them immortal, even when their swords rusted. But history did not end. A few decades later, the North would again give the world a name that would change everything. A name under which the fear of Europe would transform into a new empire. Centuries passed. The Vikings disappeared as a people, but not as a force. Their descendants became kings, Christians, traders, but the blood of the sea still called them to feats. In 1066, a descendant of Jarls, William the Conqueror, landed in southern England and conquered it. Thus ended the Viking Age and began a new one, an era of kingdoms built on their legacy. But the fear of the North did not disappear. Archaeologists still find under layers of earth traces of burned monasteries, runes on stones, traces of fire on old bells. Each find reminds us, once, a few hundred people were able to make a continent tremble. Their weapon was not only iron, but also an idea, the belief that a person can challenge fate and win. Today it seems impossible that a handful of seafarers without maps or gunpowder managed to change the course of history. But in this lies their eternal trace. They proved that determination and discipline can be more terrifying than any army. Europe learned to defend itself, but first it had to learn to fear. And now, as we look at the gray northern sea, the question remains, what gave these people the strength to go where others saw death? Perhaps in each of us there still lives the shadow of that warrior who goes to meet the storm, knowing, beyond the horizon, beyond fear, eternity begins.